The long-term impacts of climate have been recognized probably for more than a century now in terms of emissions of CO2 leading to an increase in temperature. And there's been a series of big international meetings that have been set up to try and do something about CO2 emissions and climate change. The one that I first remember is the Kyoto Protocol. Essentially, at the governmental level or the United Nations level, all these protocols have failed to curtail CO2 production in any way. The only way they could have succeeded was by taking 90% of humanity and winding back the clock 100 years in terms of progress and poverty and so on. And that's basically the reason why they failed. Right? Like no country is going to unilaterally or even multilaterally be able to force through the sort of policy changes necessary to push their economy in the direction of, say, North Korea. Improvements in efficiency and user efficiency and so on. You can reduce the total amount of energy you're using. You can reduce your personal climate impact, but reducing it by 90% it's just an ask that most people are not prepared to accept.
I think around the 1970s, we started to consume less energy, especially in the West. You look at cars in the 1960s and 70s, and I think you can actually see this in how cars look. I think cars started to become a lot less beautiful because we started to think about fuel efficiency. We started to think about fuel economy and using less energy, and cars became less of this beautiful thing that's very powerful and very fast and fluid. And it became more of a function of energy consumption.
But only really recently did we get wind power. If you look at before the 1990s, there's almost none in the US. And then it does scale up pretty massively. And then we had the same thing happen with solar power, but not until like the early 2010s before it became any sort of a significant percentage of the overall mix. And with those increasing sources, we have reduced our burning of coal as a nation. But for about the last 20 years, our total electric power production in the country has been approximately flat, while I think population has grown. So that could be read as like we're becoming more efficient, but also we are certainly using electricity to do transport now with battery electric vehicles, which is like fundamentally changing what that total energy mix can be. And you basically have residential, industrial, and transport uses.
I think when humanity tries to consume less energy and it gets into a mindset of energy conservation, our lives start to be a function of that in not a very beautiful way. And in the reverse, when you're in an abundant era of energy, things become beautiful. You're not necessarily concerned about these marginal use cases of energy, and you really just make what you want.
We should certainly not limit ourselves from using energy to better our lives.
It's an interesting challenge, and two things can be true at once. Energy can be the root of all things good, and it can also have negative externalities, such as a changing climate as well. Then that's the problem to solve.
It appears to me that the impact, particularly on the developing world, of pushing our technology back to the point where hunger wasn't largely a solved problem, for example, is actually far worse than the impacts of climate change, even under the worst case scenario. Worst case scenario for climate change is something like coastal cities get drowned, a lot of places have increased food insecurity, but overall the world is still a net producer of food. It's a major pain in the ass and a big problem for our children and grandchildren, but it's not as bad as 6 billion people starving to death in the next 10 years. Bad, right? We have to keep these in perspective.
The key thing is to turn the conventional wisdom around so that people realize that energy is not only their friend, but their planet's friend.
I would say that energy is actually the solution to all of the problems that you think of when you think of the environment and you think of the human condition and taking care of the earth. I mean, just a good example of this is carbon in the atmosphere, right? We're slowly pushing up the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere over time. Everybody realizes this is an issue. Eventually, we're going to reach levels of CO2 which are not conducive to human life. But with enough energy, you can literally just suck it out of the atmosphere. With enough energy, we can reformat, oceans to make them habitable for the types of species of fish that we want to see. With enough energy, we can desalinate water and we can re-aerate massive portions of desert and make them beautiful and make many more species flourish in them. All of these problems are actually functions of energy consumption. So if we give ourselves the ability to consume a lot more energy, we actually get to go fix a lot of these problems that seem intractable today.
So I think there's two places that the idea of consuming less energy comes from. One is sort of old school environmental movement. To a lot of people, that means doing less, by extension, consuming less energy. And then I think more, in a more modern context, a lot of times it's certain types of climate activists who associate energy with fossil fuels, and they want us to use less fossil fuels. But that means more generally less energy, and that's the thing that will help the climate.
everything we know and love. The cost of living crisis is part of the cost of oil crisis.
Anyone who thinks that the limitation of energy is a good idea is totally ignorant as to the role that energy plays in everyday life, or evil and trying to just hoard it for themselves.
The environmental movement, Club of Rome paper, and like this whole kind of like Paul Ehrlich movement within the environmental movement that was not just like, we want clean energy, but like more energy is bad because human growth and flourishing is bad. And I think Paul Ehrlich, the population bomb guy, said that giving humanity more power is like giving an idiot child a machine gun or something to that effect.
The environmental movement, which really got going in the 1970s in the US and globally, really took such a short-sighted, a very like small-minded, frankly, view of it. But I understand where it's coming from, right? They were sort of afraid of a society that was getting rid of conservation. We weren't going to have like beautiful natural landscapes anymore. But they're not at odds with energy usage at massive scale, which provides for technology breakthroughs, that provides for prosperous societies. We can do them in responsible ways. We can do them in beautiful ways. And I would love to see us have both. Like, let's have beautiful landscapes, let's have conservation, while we also have industry and we have, a society that everyone can be prosperous in.
As a species, as humanity, right, on our whole planet, I think it's inarguable that you could say that if the average person had more energy, their life would improve.
You look at the developing world and countries that have not yet reached the US levels of prosperity, well, guess what? They also don't have the US levels of energy consumption and energy access. So you can see it around us like, it seems like we see this strong correlation of energy with human flourishing.
I think it would be a massive step backwards to consume less energy per capita. Limiting ourselves from a materials standpoint, certain industrial processes like manufacturing aluminum, there's energy intensive, and not being able to have that material would harm our life in countless ways.
We have a whole other half of the technologies that we might have had that we didn't get because of the reliance on energy and the fact that we flatlined. For 50 years, we have been a 10 kilowatt society, 10 kilowatts per person, and the total amount of energy that the society has used has gone up, but that's because the population has increased. So the energy per person is still at about 10 kilowatts.
So I'm more a fan of abundance. How do you create energy abundance, and how do you actually make more resources available in a more abundant way? Tapping into those exponential growth curves is way more important for civilization and progress versus trying to stay at where we are or go down below.
Does anyone actually believe that we would have wars if resources weren't a constraint? My thinking is that by providing enough access to energy, by making resources infinitely available, making it so people don't have to think of land as something that needs to be conquered in order to gain access to these resources, I think we could end war on planet Earth.
Energy has really set the tone for geopolitics in the 20th century. Who has the oil, who can refine it, who can move it around. This is a tool that I think we figured out pretty early in the 20th century was going to shift the scales of power throughout the world. And for a long time, America recognized that we need that. We need that dominance. We need to be able to produce our own fuel, to export our own fuel. I think we kind of got lost in the 70s though. We decided that, oil is bad, that it's running out, that it's affecting the environment. And then rather than finding solutions to that problem, we essentially tried to push oil away, right? We tried to push it to other places to be drilled and other places to be refined and slowly shift away from it. And I think that really negatively affected our position in the world too. And it caused us to get involved in conflicts over where that oil was coming from when we actually had a lot of natural stores of it here.
I think it's certainly true that most of the world's armed conflict was largely led by resource scarcity.
That could be space, it could be materials, it could be water, it could be power directly. But if essentially that you're able to allow different cultures to thrive within their own context without having to butt up against each other, without having to try to feel like they're in a constrained environment where violence is the only solution. If you're able to just take that out of the picture, the idea of killing each other by the tens of thousands or millions, that's what I think we can really put to end by making resources just fundamentally available to everybody.